The title of the recording was Technology from Tool to Totalitarianism, Human Health Held Hostage. Fairly provocative title. Thank you to Richard Giles and Jim Straka, two people who've been working tirelessly there to help their community for many decades, and they organised this event. The title describes the change in technology that's been going on since about the 1990s when we all got PCs, which were first on our desktops at work, and they were helping us with email and word processing, and for some of us, computer simulations, to what we're looking to in the not too distant future is technology becoming a big brother to us. So rather than a helpful servant, more of a tyrant taskmaster, where we have to do and fill in forms and do as told and fed back by technologies and computer systems around the world. The way that transition has happened has been slow, but right now we're in what I call the ubiquity transition. That is that everything is connected to everywhere and technology is everywhere. And when I say technology, I just don't mean the actual software, I actually mean the communication signals as well. They are electromagnetic fields that are connecting everything. Children are being exposed to them with them on their lap. It's even been mandated in preschool. People have them on their wrists. People have them near their head for many hours a day as they use their phones. Young people have them on their faces. And the whole world has been connected. There's concerns about the effect on the environment and on human health, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. If we look at the way the world was created, there are actually many, many electromagnetic fields and moving charges going on all around us all the time, which we don't see and we don't feel, and yet they're essential for life. This is a diagram taken from Arthur Firstenberg's book, The Invisible Rainbow, which I recommend as a very good introduction to this topic. Now, if you look at electromagnetic fields, they're actually made up of moving charges, and the natural ones actually spread out across the universe. Protons, neutrons, electrons, photons, from one end of the universe to the other, sending information throughout the universe. And inside of our Milky Way, we have tendrils of electromagnetic fields emanating out from the Milky Way. And then inside our solar system, we have the sun sending what's called the solar wind, which is electrons and neutrons towards the Earth, as well as gamma rays and X-rays. And then the Earth is rotating on its axis with its own magnetic core and its own magnetic field, and it drags in the solar wind and creates the magnetosphere around the Earth. And then inside of that, there's another layer called the ionosphere that traps most of the gamma rays and the X-rays, the harmful ones coming from the sun, and creates like a protective layer around the Earth. But some of them still get through, and they bounce off the rocks and the soil and off particles in the air. And then when we're walking on the Earth, our feet are negative because the Earth is like this huge negative earth sink. And then our heads are positively charged at about 150 volts between us and the Earth. And then the trees bring up the negative electrical charges up through their branches and attract the positively charged clouds. And that's what brings the rain. So if you chop down the trees, you're going to reduce the clouds and therefore the rain. And so there's this whole circuitry going on the whole time, from negative to positive, negative to positive. And then we have constant discharge from positive to negative of huge thousands of volts of charge coming down from the clouds down to the Earth to discharge. And that's happening with lightning strikes at about 100 per second somewhere on the Earth. And that huge discharge, constant discharge, creates a pulse that goes on around the Earth at about 10 cycles per second, and it's called the Schumann resonance. It's just below 10 cycles per second. And the Schumann resonance is very important for our sleep-wake cycle and our bodily functions, and it may even be essential for DNA replication. Now, the light from the sun is natural electromagnetic waves coming in. It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum called the visible spectrum. And those rays coming from the sun, they bounce off everything and go in all directions. And they're much more powerful than man-made electromagnetic fields, but because they're going in all directions, they cancel each other out. And they're not affecting us in any particular way, except, you know, if you stay in the sun too long, you get sunburn and there's ultraviolet light. But most of the visible light is actually random, and it's called electromagnetic radiation. But we have electromagnetic fields from many man-made devices. So this is what's actually going on now with our young people and us as well, old people as well. We're sitting many days. This is a young person sitting in school. We have a square wave pulse there coming from the modem in the classroom, perhaps another signal coming from the mesh in the system. They have, there's the waves coming from the towers on the nearby buildings or masts that are often near schools. And this child's also sitting there with headphones on, so they've got an electric field going through their brain, as well as that laptop on their lap sending signals into their stomach and their reproductive system. And that may be going on for 1 hour a day, 4 hours a day, or 8 hours a day, depending on what they do when they come from school. And if you can see here, this is an artist's impression of actually what is going on. We can't see these waves, but if you could see them all in different frequencies. So they're represented as different colors going through the atmosphere around us all the time. And they're not smooth, sweet, kind waves. They're jiggity, jaggedy, and tumultuous. And they have an effect on human biology. Now, we'll just start, though, with the effect on nature. This is a story about a man who recorded nature from about the early 2000s onwards. He was recording nature in the area of Australia, one of the World Heritage listed parks. They're called Gondwana. And we called it Gondwana land in Australia when we showed it to the world. But the Gondwana forests are ancient forests. And this one's in northern New South Wales. And this man, Mark Broomhall, lived nearby. And he started to notice, because he went through the forest constantly recording and watching animals, he could go through the forest and name for you 200 species in Latin off the top of his head. He knew them so well. And in the early 2000s, he started to notice the disappearance and that the animals were moving away from the top of the forest, from their natural habitat area down to lower areas that weren't as suitable for their living. And he wasn't sure what was going on, but he was recording it. And it was only in 2009 that he started to work out what was going on, because up there on the towers, in 2009, there was a 3G upgrade, as well as 150 pay TV channels were put on the towers. And he records this: I witnessed the exodus of 27 bird species from Mount Nardi, while simultaneously insect volumes and species variety dropped dramatically. And so he started to realize it was actually the digital technologies that had been affecting he called them critters, his critters, all this time. And that was confirmed when in 2013, when there was a 4G upgrade, when he witnessed another rapid exodus of another 49 bird species, as well as bats, cicadas, moths, butterflies, frogs and tadpoles and ants, all drastically reduced. And he started to realize what was going on. And then to confirm his hypothesis, in 2015, there was a power outage for 3 days. And when that happened, the termites came out of the soil, and all of the birds came back to feast on the termites for 3 days while the power was off. And then many species returned just for that short period of time. And then when the power came back on and the towers started transmitting again, they all left. And he said, I never saw the termites ever again after that. And Mark Brimhall wrote a report for the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, sent it to them in about 2017, and to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature at the same time. But there's been no reply, no response. And Mark Brimhall stayed up there, and he himself got sick and succumbed to whatever was going on up there, and he died a couple of years ago. But his report is there, and I will give a longer presentation on that in a separate video. The trees are affected by man-made electromagnetic radiation and fields has been documented. Not as much, but people around the world, there's a paper on it, a German paper on it, just describing here how you can have a tower here beaming through a city, and then when the beams hit the building, they block the waves, and the trees directly behind that might be safe, but those who are exposed, you can observe that the leaves are brown and shrunken or don't grow, or the trees won't grow. Their leaves drop prematurely, and there's just irregular growth in the trees. And here we've got some photos from Australia of trees near high voltage power lines, where the leaves are brown and shrunken and are not doing so well. And this is sometimes attributed to fungus or insects, but you can actually see that it's happening near the high voltage lines, and this needs to be investigated and hasn't. So if we're going on to bees as a focus for the effects on wildlife, because they've been studied the most, honeybees have magnetite crystals in their fat cells, and they use magnetoreception for finding their way, and so that they're sensitive to geomagnetic fields of the Earth. And so the fact that we're covering the Earth with electromagnetic fields, it's been of interest whether or not that's affecting the bees. And I'm just going to summarize a few of those studies here. So they started in about the 1970s, mid-1970s. Just here we got a whole lot of beehives that were put under high voltage power lines. And when the bees became hyperactive, stung each other. They sealed their hive entrances with bee propolis, which is a mild insulator. It's the best they've got, and they died. And then 1981, there was a repeat study of that, and it was actually funded by an electric company. But what was found was abnormal deposits of propolis put there to protect themselves. They lost their queens. They reduced their production. There was a lower hive weight, and less than 30% survived over winter. And a similar one in 2023 with more understanding of the processes that are going on. So there's more heat shock proteins which are involved in antioxidant activity and changes in expression of behavior-related genes. And what that means is that the bees when they're not doing as well, they're under stress, there's less pollen and honey harvested, and the plants themselves produce fewer seeds. Now, this effect on plant species and plant abundance is important for our survival, not just for the bees' survival. And if we look at bees and mobile phone communications, there's been several studies on that too. this study, Indian study, hasn't been published formally, but it has been reported that after 10 days there was colony collapse and the workers failed to return. Since then, the studies haven't exposed the bees for 10 days because the researchers don't want to kill the bees off. So they gave them shorter exposure times. But even then, there's declining colony strength and the egg laying rate of the queen. The foragers themselves are affected. There's no honey or pollen in the colony by the end of the study with the loss of colony. And this one is a modelling study that shows they looked at actually what's being absorbed by the bees' bodies. And they find that as the field exposure, that's the intensity of the field exposure, increases by 10%, then the power of that absorbed by the bee increases by 3 times or more. So they're absorbing that electromagnetic field in their bodies. And this study showed they actually had a phone that had the signal on, sending signal, and then they had a phone that was just in talk mode. It wasn't silent, it was in, sorry, there was one phone in talk mode and there was another phone in silent mode. And they actually found that the bees, as well as reducing their activity, they actually en masse moved towards the phone that was in talk mode, that was active. It was as if they recognized it as an invader and they were buzzing around it, trying to get it to leave. And they saw inside the bees' bodies, first of all, an increase and then a decrease of biomolecules for fighting stress. And that's what we call hormetic response. So first of all, there's an adaptive response. They try to fight the stress that's happening to them, but then their bodies can't cope with that anymore and they can't keep continuing. They're depleted in their ability to do that. And so there's a decrease of biomolecules for fighting stress, and then the system just gets exhausted. This study was actually recorded using audiograms, the actual swarming activity of the bees, and by Fava in 2011. And when you listen to the bees, when there was a mobile phone handset in there, after 25 minutes, they started to buzz, like the intensity and their frequency actually increased. And that lasted for 12 hours. And this study was repeated again in a similar way over New Year's Eve by Fava and Johansson in 2019. They looked at several frequencies, but this was just a tower 800 meters away from the beehives. And once again, they did the audiogram. And what they found was that they got that stronger working Piper signal at midnight when everyone was sending text messages saying Happy New Year. And then they got it, that was locally, but then they got it again at the times that corresponded to points around the globe when it became midnight. So it was 2 hours later and then 2 hours later. And each time it lasted 15 minutes. So the telecommunication signals intensifying was actually affecting the bees' activity in that local hive. Another thing about bees is it's an amazing aspect of bees and flowers is that bees have a positive charge in their body and that flowers have a negative charge, and that bees find flowers because of that attraction, that actual electromagnetic attraction between the bee and the flower. So it's not just that they use the colors of the flowers, they actually use the charge of the flowers and they're drawn to them. So that's the effect on bees. Now, are there effects on humans? Well, we know that we're electrical beings. We know that our brains send electrical signals constantly, that we have several kind of stable patterns of brain waves that are going on in our brains that seem to represent different types of thinking. So gamma waves is deep focus, beta waves when we're thinking, concentrating, alpha waves when we're awake and at peace, theta waves are when we're daydreaming, and deltas when we're asleep. And we also know that our hearts are electrical devices, and you put electrical signal through the heart, you're going to change it or stop it or harm it. So we know in broad brush stroke ways that we have electrical signals going through our bodies. We know our neurons and our nerves send electrical signals, but there's so much we don't know. We understand now that cells absorb photons and send photons, and we know that the movement of charges across cell membranes and between cells has as an effect on the information that's being sent through the bodies, but we're only just starting to understand that, and it's much, much more complex than we ever imagined. So the effects of these man-made electric fields on human health have been looked at for decades, starting with really a lot of military interest in the 70s. But many people haven't heard about it because it hasn't been publicised. And so a group of independent scientists have got together in the last few decades, and they've put together reports looking at the effects of man-made electric fields and magnetic fields in many different areas of health. And this is the Bioinitiative report. And it's being published in 2007, 2012, 2022. And you can see there's so many different areas where they found evidence for damage: sperm, reproduction, children, effects on autism, electrohypersensitivity, the blood-brain barrier, tumours, the nervous system, etc., DNA, etc. So there's a lot of evidence there that suggests a problem. And in particular, there's a condition called electrohypersensitivity, which is where people who are like bees are becoming sensitive to these fields. In fact, the first cases of electrohypersensitivity were recorded back in when the telegraph lines were being put across the world, and when trams were and power lines were first being put in cities like in London in the late 1880s, and people then were becoming hypersensitive, some people. And in those days it was called neurasthenia. But then Freud came along and changed the name, unfortunately, to hysteria. So we wanted to know whether or not there's any evidence for it today. Well, in the last decade or so, there's been a few reports actually from several decades ago, is when people started to look at whether or not people were being affected by it. Once mobile phones and communications became prevalent, and also even PCs and desktops, people started to report these symptoms. And there were several studies. There've been several studies on them, and the symptoms are headaches, dizziness, heart issues, tinnitus, difficulty concentrating, nervous system effects, irritability, insomnia, fatigue. The earlier ones, when people were sitting in front of computers, there was a lot of complaints of skin rashes and burning skin and face and hands. And when I'm saying headaches here, I'm talking about not just your normal headache, but headaches to the point of migraines, to the point of torture. And these are so painful that people can't stay in the same vicinity as the electromagnetic fields that they're sensitive to, which makes this condition disabling, because these people can't be around electromagnetic fields. And mostly these days, many people are sensitive to mobile phone signals. And they're what we call lepers of technology, because they can't be where there are people because of the ubiquity of electromagnetic fields coming from everyone's phone. So most of the research that's been done was done over 10 years ago. And so we wanted to know whether or not the numbers are going up or that it's stayed the same. And our senior author of the paper I'm about to show you Anne Steinman, she decided to do an online investigation of prevalence. What that means is you create a survey, and the survey is sent out online. And she used a company called Dynata, which is a very well-respected online survey organization. And what they do is they have about 50,000 people in their database, and they make sure that when they run a survey, that they choose people from each country so that the age and the gender and the regional distribution of the people in the survey is representative of the way it is in that country. And as well as that, they invite people to do surveys, but they randomly assign them to surveys so that it's not people decide to do this survey because it's their issue. They don't know which survey they're going to be invited to. So in this survey, the survey looked at 3 countries, the US, Australia, and Canada, with over 1,000 people in each country. And we asked people about whether or not they considered themselves to be exceptionally sensitive to wireless devices, such as smart meters, mobile phones, masts, Fitbits, modems, and whether or not so that's self-diagnosed wireless sensitivity, or whether or not a doctor had diagnosed them as being sensitive to wireless. And we also asked them the survey also asked them about multiple chemical sensitivity, asthma, autism, and sensitivity to fragrances, to look at whether or not there's co-prevalence. That is, there are people who are sensitive to wireless and also have asthma, for example. And what we found when we did the stats was that there was quite a substantial percentage of the population in each country that were either wireless sensitivity or doctor diagnosed. So on average, across all the countries, there's about 14% now of the population that are saying I'm sensitive, or a doctor has diagnosed me as being sensitive. And that number is about the 14% in the US, a bit higher in Australia and a bit lower in Canada. And what that means is 86% of people aren't, but 14% of people are. And that's up in the high end of the percentages, because there's previous studies, they range from 3 to 13%. And so here we're moving up now into 14 to 18% as technology becomes more ubiquitous and more used and being used for longer. And the comorbid prevalence, that is so of the people who said they were wireless sensitive, we can see that the comorbidities are really quite high. That people who also have chemical sensitivity, multiple chemical sensitivity or fragrance sensitivity, that's up in the 80 to 90% range. People who also have asthma, there's over 70% of the wireless sensitivity people also have asthma. And people who are wireless sensitive, over 50% of them have autism or are in the or have autistic spectrum disorder of some type. And so they're quite high co-prevalence statistics, suggesting that there's something going on underlying these conditions that may be common to all of them. Another result that we found, which was interesting, was that proportionally there were more males than females who said they were sensitive or were diagnosed by doctors with wireless sensitivity. So when I say more males than females proportionally, what I mean is, if in the country, just say we had in the actual whole data set, we had this many females and this many males, But the ones who actually said they were sensitive, it went the other way. So there are actually more males than females. And that was greater for the prevalence inside the males was greater for the 25 to 34-year-olds. And then second greatest for the males, 35 to 44-year-olds. Now that's a viable workforce of males. And so that's an important result that needs to be noted, and it's of concern. The limitations of the study is that we only looked at 18 to 65-year-olds, so we didn't look at younger people, we didn't look at older people, and it's self-reported data. So at the moment, there is no objective test for wireless sensitivity, but this is the first study that shows prevalence. And once you've done the first study, you can then go on and dig further and do more detailed studies to try and understand what's going on. And it's possible that the reason the numbers have gone up is because of the longer exposures and greater exposures. Now, it's possible that there's an underdiagnosis because not everyone knows why they're experiencing the symptoms that we listed at the beginning, why they're getting headaches or why they're having sleep problems. So there could be an underdiagnosis in that as well. So we don't know. And it is possible, though, because we saw this co-prevalence, that there's some underlying factors that are common. So some of those underlying factors have got to do with inflammatory conditions. These conditions are known to be based on inflammation. So asthma occurs from inflammation. Autism, the inflammation levels in the brain can lead to autistic symptoms. So that can be created from oxidative or nitrosative stress, which happens when there's stress inside the cell that the body's defense mechanisms can't cope with. And you start to get this. At first, you get oxidative reactions that try to get rid of stress factors, but then they get overloaded, and then they can't cope, and so you start to get oxidative stress because you keep on building oxidation, but you don't have enough antioxidants to deal with it. Excuse me. Now, there's also blood-brain barrier disruption. That's when there's in the brain, there's the blood capillaries, and then there's all of the neurons and the complexity underneath that. And there's a barrier between the blood supply and the brain cells in order to protect toxins from getting from the bloodstream over into the neurons. But if that barrier is breached, then it's possible that you can get toxins across and invading the brain to create inflammation. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But the blood-brain barrier leakage is called leakage, but that crossing of the blood-brain barrier has been shown to be an effect of electromagnetic fields. It's one of the strongest effects that have been shown over the last several decades, actually. Okay. So it's time for a break.